turn your camera off. And we're going to finish on time at 5:15. So a brief introduction. We're East London Research School, based here at Sheringham Nursery School and Children's Centre in Newham, East London. We work very closely with the Education Endowment Foundation, and we share a mission, which is breaking the link between family income and educational achievement. And that is really our passion, and our driving force is to find practical, evidence-informed solutions to inequalities in our education system. But I do want to put that into context, which is that we very strongly believe that there needs to be a step change socially around child poverty. We do not think that inequality, issues of poverty, exclusion, racism can be tackled through improving education. We need to tackle these as a society. And we saw firsthand at every stage, and we continue to see firsthand through the COVID-19 pandemic, how poorer and other marginalized groups are hit very, very hard by the inequalities that we have in our society at the moment. So we are not intending to imply that education and early years in themselves are a sufficient response to the inequalities that we have. But we do want to say that we can do stuff today, tomorrow, next week, and next month as educators that will make a difference to children's life chances. And that it's a moral imperative for me that we do what we can to support the children and the families that we're working with. So really, the Research School Network and its research schools like the EEF are about two gaps. The first gap is the gap in learning between kids who are eligible for free school meals and all other children and young people, all the other kids out there in our schools and early years settings. And we know that on average, there's a 4.6-month gap between children eligible for free school meals and all other children at the end of the EYFS. And we're mindful that for 5-year-olds, 4.6 months is a lot. You know, relative to 5 years of age, 4.6 months is a big deal. Now, we know that at a child level, there is a lot of diversity. So we know about those children from families who are in receipt of free school meals, but the families and the schools are really supporting the children well, and they're doing brilliantly. But on average, the picture is extremely negative and concerning. So we know that that gap doubles by the end of primary and doubles again by the end of secondary schooling. A majority of 19-year-olds who've been eligible for free school meals leave education without a good standard of recognised qualification in English and maths. There is a lot of nuance here, particularly for children and young people learning English as an additional language. So we know some groups start off and have that gap by the end of the EYFS, but when we look at the curve of those children's progress, we see a lot of catch up and acceleration, and we see other groups where that isn't the case. So again, nuance is important here, but so is the big picture that our education system is fundamentally ruined by inequalities. The second gap, so I said there were two gaps we work on. The second gap is what you might call the knowing-doing gap. We know a lot about effective early years education. We know a lot about effective education in general. We've got a lot of very solid evidence. There are still huge gaps, but we have a lot of evidence. And what I mean by the knowing-doing gap is that we know this stuff, but it's hard to do. It's hard to put it into action. And this evening is all about one of those bridges between what we know and what we can do. The Education Endowment Foundation exists to synthesize the best quality research. So we don't have to trawl through 1,000 journal papers about cognitive science. The EF team have done that for us, and they have given us the headlines, the best bets around important areas of educational research. So we urge you to use the toolkit on the EF website to access that high quality evidence and research. The EF is also about generation. We are generating research in important areas. So at the moment, for example, here in East London, we're working on a project about teaching maths in early years and Key Stage 1 through picture books. So generation is important. And mobilization, taking the evidence and putting it into practice so it makes a difference to children's learning every day, every week, every term. So mobilizing the evidence through the research schools so we can work together and put it into action. So that's why the EF toolkit, including the EF early years toolkit, is so important. It gives us that accessible summary of the best evidence we've got in education. Last thing you're going to hear from me, just to note, some of the recent updates from the EF have been around effective use of teacher feedback to improve pupil learning, the cognitive science review, the effective professional development review, and most recently, the update to improving literacy in Key Stage 2. So there's been a lot of activity. And if you go on our website, or if you go on the EF website, you can keep up with all of that. So in this evening's session, we're going to be hearing from Shaghaygh in a moment, followed by Professor Victoria Murphy. And then we're going to have a discussion between Professor Murphy and Fliss James and Shaghaygh Khademian focused on the research and evidence. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and hand over with great pleasure to Shaghaygh, who's one of our terrific evidence leads in education.
Okay, hi, thank you so much for that, Julian. Hi, I'm Shaghaygh Khademian, and I'm just going to talk about my experience of what it was like when my family first moved to the UK. So I was 9 years old, I grew up in Iran, and just kind of give you a bit of a context, my childhood in Iran in the 80s, there wasn't a lot of education involved because it was during the war of Iran and Iraq. So families were being moved around on a regular basis. So there was a period of time where I actually didn't go to school. And a lot of my education in Farsi was actually done at home by my mum, who was a teacher herself. So we came here when I was 9.5 years old. I went to a primary school in Cubitt Town in Tower Hamlets when I was in year 5. And within a very short time, I mean, my experience in primary school is all very vague. When people ask me about it, I don't really have much to say because a lot of it was just kind of trying to survive and figure out what was going on around me. What I remember is that I had a lady who was a parent volunteer. Her name was Tina. She would read with me once or twice a week. And what that did in return was I actually got me to really appreciate reading, because then within 6 months, I was able to read in English. I remember my first ever sentence I was able to read. I think I was on the DLR with my mum, and it was like, "Do not smoke." And I was so proud of myself for being able to read that, because I thought, right, I can put things together. But then, you know, within a very short time, I think the teachers themselves were quite surprised that I could read. And when I reflect back on it now, I can see how powerful it was, because just having someone in addition to come and take me out of class and read with me one-to-one, it then gave me that pleasure to then being able to go away and read and then actually excel at something that I was good at. A lot of times I used to just look at everyone's lips, and I sometimes find myself still doing that, because I used to then copy the way that movement was happening. So I could, I don't know, almost like parrot everything that was going on around me. But I think what's what was quite important is that, you know, a lot of times I used to just walk around by myself, not quite sure what was happening. And the teachers didn't really know how to support me in that either. The majority of the children, although they had English as an additional language, they were second generation or third generation of a Bangladeshi community where we had just come here. And I had an aunt that had lived here since the 70s. My uncle was English. So, you know, we had that support, but everything else had to be done with an old school dictionary and kind of try and find out all the vocabulary and what was taking place. What I find later on when I went into secondary school is that I struggled quite a lot because I didn't have the comprehension. I didn't actually have that academic vocabulary that was really needed in order for me to excel in certain subjects. So my science was always not very strong. However, I was much better at sociology and I was better at things like psychology, and that supported me. But then when it came to certain academic language, even now, I have to go back and do a lot of referencing when I want to have certain things that I would like to speak to everyone about. But I think what helped with me is that my first language was very, very secure. I was already 9.5 years old. That was not going to get disturbed. Parents were, you know, both educated, so they were from an academic background. That in itself really helped me. So when we used to go food shopping, for example, my mum would try and say the words in English, even though she herself didn't know English. My dad didn't know English. I came to England knowing, I think I knew good morning and I knew good afternoon, and that's the extent of everything that I knew. So I was suddenly like thrown in, and it's so go with it now and just try and see what you can pick up. I think what what I did find challenging is as the times went by, you know, in addition to secondary school, when it came to going to university, I always doubted myself when it came to my writing skills because I couldn't write as well as others. And I think, you know, in terms of us working in education, it helps to be able to support children in lots of other areas and not kind of just allowing those who are new arrival just to kind of sit there. Because I know there was lots of conversations many years ago about, you know, the 6 months and the silent period that any children that had English as an initial language would go through. And there was a lot of times when I used to sit there and I used to reflect and think about what was going on. But sometimes I used to just try and process two different things in different languages, where even now I don't count in English, I can count in Persian. I'm much better at it. I'm really fluent. And I can do mathematics in Persian, but I can't do mathematics in English. So I think, you know, thinking about all those different things that takes place in a child's brain or anyone that has two languages is really powerful. And it's actually a really great thing to be able to celebrate with children and to recognize their language. Obviously, nobody spoke Persian. I don't really think it's a language that is spoken in England even now. But I think sometimes I used to go into primary school and think it would be so nice if they just said something to me in Persian so I could understand if it was just a good morning or if it was just a goodbye, because that would have gone a long way for my own confidence and just kind of felt like I was a part of what was taking place. I'm just going to kind of reflect a little bit in kind of my own current situation as a deputy head. So I work in a primary school in Tower Hamlets because I actually wanted to come back and always work in Tower Hamlets. I felt so grateful for everything that had been provided for me for, you know, those 2 years of my primary school experience, that I wanted to kind of come back once I became a teacher and support teachers and support the children, because I knew what it was like to kind of feel alone and isolated and having to learn a language from the beginning. And now what's interesting is we have quite a lot of families that are new arrivals coming from various countries, from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, a couple from Iran, you know, through boats and very, very traumatic experiences that are coming into the country. And I sometimes sit back even now and reflect how I'm now finding it challenging to be able to support these children. And I just kind of think, I wonder if that's how my teachers felt as well, where they felt at loss, where they want to be able to help, but there's so many resources that are cut and there's not enough available freely to be able to kind of access and tap into all of that, to really to sit with the children and have those meaningful conversations. I was lucky, I had a parent volunteer with me. We have some parent volunteers at the moment, but then, you know, there's add COVID into it and how many people we can let into our buildings. It's an extra stress for everyone to go through. But I do think, you know, if anyone kind of does have new arrival of children coming into their schools, is thinking about the children's trauma and if they've experienced anything, because, you know, I hadn't just gone through, you know, an entire childhood of war for like 8 years of my life, but, you know, we came from France to England. So actually, by the time I arrived in England, I could speak a bit more French than I could English. And then when I went to university, I think my love for French then kind of came out as well. And I thought, I want to go and learn French as well. And so I think, you know, to really be able to tap into children's passion for languages and make them realize that, you know, just because it's not a European language or a widely spoken language, it's still so powerful, and it's so important to be able to have their language and appreciate it. Because now I can support, you know, some of those Afghan families that are coming into our schools. I can support those, you know, 1 or 2 Iranians that are coming in, or the Kurdish families. And it's the first time that I'm actually able to use what I have. So yeah, I mean, like I said, my experience is very different to some children that were 2nd or 3rd generations. I was a 1st generation. Most of my family that are here are, apart from one of my cousins and my nephew now. And I think it's just being able to support children as much as anybody can, really, and not letting them just get on with it, or just leaving them to one by thinking, oh, they're not going to access the curriculum because they don't speak English. But there's a lot that's actually being taken in children that have got languages. And then, you know, if there is that dedication that someone can do some of those pre-vocabulary teaching, because that's what actually then helped me in being able to read later on, and then going into university, and then kind of doing a master's and doing what I'm doing now. So yeah, so I'm just kind of going to leave my experience at that. I'm not quite sure if that was okay.
Shaghaygh, that was about as far from okay as it's possible to be. That was really brilliant and insightful, and I think that I can't thank you enough for putting all of this into the context that you've done. That was phenomenally powerful and important for us all to hear. So I'm very pleased now to hand over to Professor Victoria Murphy. We might have a little glitchy moment here where we do share screen and everything. Fliss is going to unmute because Fliss understands how to do share screen with 2 screens, but I'm going to mute now. But it's my great pleasure to hand over from the wonderful Shaghaygh to Professor Victoria Murphy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Julian. Can everyone hear me? I say everyone, I can't see, I can see Julian. So Julian, can you just sort of, yeah, you can hear me. And in terms of the screen, which screen are you seeing? The correct one?
Yeah, we're seeing the correct screen.
Okay, brilliant. Okay.
Absolutely spot on. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. But obviously someone will shout at me if everything goes badly at some point. So, well, let me just say how delighted I am to be here. It's a real pleasure. And I just to echo what Julian said a moment ago about how phenomenal it is to see so many people here on a dark December evening at the end of what has been another extremely challenging and difficult term for everyone. So it's just a testament to your commitment and professionalism that you're here, and thank you very much for being here. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here as well. Not least of which to be able to hear the kinds of experiences from someone like Shaghaygh. I mean, I agree with Julian, that was an extremely interesting and powerful testimony, if you like, about the experiences of being an EAL student in early stages of formal education, but then also thinking about the other end and what it's like to be a professional trying to support EAL learners as well. So thank you very much, Shaghaygh, for sharing that with us. What I'm going to do in my presentation this afternoon is to talk a little bit about research and try and ask, see, now I'm trying to do, oh, okay, did it move? Did it? Yeah, okay, great. Thanks. I have done this many times before. You wouldn't be surprised to know during the pandemic, but I don't use Zoom all the time. We use Teams, so I can handle Teams a bit better. Anyway, you didn't need to know that. What I'm talking about today is I'm going to first talk about who we are talking about and the challenges and problems associated with defining who EAL children are, because that I think is a really fundamental problem in terms of who gets to be an EAL child in relation to the National Pupil Database and formal education. And then what does that mean in terms of what we, how we might be able to support them? And related to that is this notion of proficiency in English. I want to just flag up right now, I'm going to talk a lot about learning English and proficiency in English, but I don't think that's the only thing that's important. I think that both languages in a multilingual child, or all the languages in a multilingual child's linguistic landscape, are important. And I don't really want to be able to support children's development of English at the cost of the development of any of their other languages. The reality is, however, that they are, you know, if we're talking about educational context in England, that children are in England learning English as the societal language, and this is the language of formal education. So we really need to know about the development of English as well in this population. It's critical. I then want to spend a bit of time talking about the stages of development that we have observed from longitudinal research studies. Now, this doesn't mean that every child will always go through every single stage, but there is plenty of evidence to show that these stages are relatively common in minority language learners in different contexts. And so it's really helpful if we can be informed about those stages, that when they come along and we observe them in our EAL child, they will feel familiar to us. And then we will also be able to hopefully more critically examine what a child can do or not do within the appropriate context. So when we should be alarmed that something is looking amiss, potentially a signal of a language disorder, or when we can just say, no, this is just typical language development in a multilingual child. I want to spend a bit of time talking about rate of learning, how long it might take for a child to develop English, and what factors might be implicated here. Why might there be, well, there's a huge amount of variability in terms of rate of development. What factors might be associated with that? I want to also briefly talk about the role of the first language in minority language learners and what happens to it in contexts like ours, where children are being educated in one language, the dominant language, but then they have these home languages that are not as well represented in the wider society. What happens to those languages, and why should we care? Because we really should. And that's basically what I'm going to talk about. And I better start because I'm running out of time. So I'm going to start with defining EAL. So EAL is the term that English as an additional language is the term that we use in the context of the UK to identify minority language learners. And this is a sort of term that only simply denotes the notion that a child has a home language that is not the language of the wider society. It is in the minority. It doesn't mean that it's not an important language. And it may even be a language like, for example, Arabic, that is spoken by millions of people around the world. It just means that in the context in which the child is developing, that language is in the minority. So Arabic in the home is in the minority relative to English in the society and in educational contexts. Now, we know from many contexts in England, like in London, but other parts of England, that for many children who are EAL, their first real significant exposure is often at the point of intersecting with formal education. And that's important to note as well, because just because you're born here or raised here doesn't mean that you will be coming to school with really well-developed English and be ready linguistically for what's ahead of you. So it's important to recognize that as well. So next thing on the slide is how the government defines EAL, or at least how EAL is identified as a tag in the National Pupil Database. So I'm just going to read this out. Well, if I can see it, yep. Where a child was exposed to the language during early development and continues to be exposed to this language in the home or in the community. That's EAL. If a child was exposed to more than one language, which may include English, during early development, the language other than English should be recorded, irrespective of the child's proficiency in English. Now, this was a definition from many, many years ago, but to my knowledge, it hasn't changed at all. And I wanted to raise the definition with you because I think there are numerous problems with it. And the most obvious one is that it's too varied, it's too heterogeneous as a term that categorizes a subgroup of individuals. So if you think about, given that definition, who can be an EAL? Well, let's look at two ends of the spectrum. Some children are fortunate enough to be born into multilingual or bilingual families where multiple languages are available to them at birth and are continued and sustained throughout the child's development. I come from Montreal in Canada. There are many people in Montreal who speak French and English, and I'm one of them, I'm happy to say. And there are many families in Montreal that adopt a kind of strategy when they have children where one parent might speak English to their child and one parent might speak French to their child, okay? And from a research perspective, we often call children who are simultaneous bilinguals like this, we call it an example of bilingual first language acquisition, because in a context like Montreal, when you have French and English in the home, you also have French and English in the ambient environment outside of the home. So the child's development of French and English is happening in parallel, happening from the moment of birth. So it's really like the child has two first languages. Now, a child like that in England who was getting two first languages in the home, maybe even in the wider community, would be also EAL. So even English is being a native language for that child would still be tagged as EAL because there's another language in the home. Then you take a case of Shaghaygh, who, when she was a child who's just arrived from another country and doesn't know a word apart from good morning, and that child is EAL. And for many children who are new arrivals, unfortunately, are also coming from very, very significant difficult contexts. And so the language problem is one of the least of the worries that they have and the challenges that they have to face. So the definition then in terms of what we can do with it and from an educational perspective, or how it can help inform us or help us make predictions about what we should expect from our students, a definition that can accommodate both ends of a spectrum like that tends to be unhelpful in that respect, because it doesn't then end up helping us to predict. Because the child who is a simultaneous bilingual is going to have no problems with English because it's their first language. And another child who might come with absolutely no English might be expected to have significant difficulties at various points. And one of the key issues that's missing from the definition, or at least it's not even missing actually, because there is something about proficiency in English, but it's disregarded in the definition. And this is the problem, that the reference or the disregard of proficiency in English to the other languages is really a significant challenge with this particular way of conceiving of EAL. And the reason why it is such a problem is because we know from a lot of different research now in many different contexts, but much of it also from England, that proficiency in English is the strongest predictor of academic achievement for children from EAL backgrounds. and proficiency in English takes time to develop. So if we want to use a category like EAL in the National Pupil Database as a way of helping us understand potential challenges our students will face, then I would say that the EAL definition doesn't do that. And indeed, any definition or conceptualization of EAL children that doesn't take into account proficiency in English is going to be less helpful for us as educators. Now, I want to raise here, since I'm talking about proficiency in English, the Bell Foundation's EAL assessment framework. And I'm not trying to plug anything, but this links to this is included in the Padlet. And this was an assessment framework that was developed with colleagues from King's College and Cambridge and the Bell Foundation in consultation with schools and teachers in England. And they developed a set of 5 scales. They're sort of like can-do statements, and they're aimed at offering teachers a tool with which they can track the EAL child's English proficiency. So this was a real advantage. I mean, there are many ways of measuring English, but in order for it to be useful for teachers and schools, for EAL pupils, it has to be implementable, something that they can actually use. Now, the government introduced the inclusion of these proficiency in English scales in the 2017 census in January, but then the following year they pulled them. And we can talk maybe some later on about why that happened. But that was a big mistake in my view. And I also used to be the chair of NALDIC, and we talked at NALDIC and wrote about it in NALDIC about what a retrograde step this was for teachers, that these scales had been pulled. And as I said before, this is because there is evidence about the importance of proficiency in English, and a very pertinent piece of evidence comes from a report, again, that's freely available on the Bell Foundation's website by my colleague Steve Strand and my PhD student Anina Hessel. And what they did was they looked at, within one educational authority, the use of the proficiency in English scales, and they examined that relationship between how children were categorized according to these scales and their academic achievement. And they found that this was a very strong and statistically significant association. So that meant that the proficiency in English scales then were able to make predictions, were informative about the academic achievement of EAL pupils. So they have the potential, and there is evidence to indicate that they have the potential to be really, really helpful for teachers. So these scales are freely available, as I've already said, and even though the government has pulled them as a mandatory implementation, there's nothing stopping teachers and schools for continuing to use them. And so I would certainly recommend teachers do that if they're concerned about tracking their EAL children's proficiency in English, because they should be concerned about that. And I think they would find that extremely useful. So that's the end of my first little bullet point outline. The second thing now I want to move on to is just briefly looking at the sort of typical stages of second language, in this case, English development in EAL children. And these stages were probably first articulated by Tabors in 1997 from research that she did in a university nursery setting. But as I said before, there's lots of other pieces of research which confirm that these are sort of the standard stages that we can expect. So the stages are: the child will first enter a home language use stage. There will then be a nonverbal period, followed by telegraphic or formulaic use, followed by productive language use. And I'm just going to briefly go through each one of those. So home language use is exactly what it says on the tin. The child comes to school only speaking Farsi and so speaks Farsi. They don't know any English. The fact that nobody else speaks Farsi is not important to the child. This is the only language the child knows, so that's the language they use. Now, not surprisingly, this particular stage of children's development can be very brief because children are very intelligent and they rapidly realize that this isn't getting them very far because nobody else speaks Farsi, so I'm not able to use it. So it can be a very brief stage, but it is quite common for children to enter the formal education with no second language skills by adopting this strategy. It can last up to 4 months, however, and echoing what Julian said a little while ago, 4 months in a young person's life in an educational setting is a massive amount of time. So that can have significant consequences on that child if they continue to persist in using their home language exclusively. So the next documented phase is the nonverbal phase. Many researchers or people might know this as the silent phase. Stephen Krashen, for example, uses the term the silent phase. And again, this is a very, this does what it says on the tin. This is when the child's not saying anything. So it is alleged that, and I believe this is correct, that the child during a silent or nonverbal phase is accumulating a lot of knowledge of the language around them. So that a lot of language acquisition is happening, is what I want to say. But what's not happening is a lot of production. So their child is not going to be using very much English, or very few anyway, English words, maybe the odd word here and there. Tabor's documented that EAL children in this stage develop nonverbal communication strategies as a way to try and get things done. So, pointing at things and gesturing and so forth. So the children are, again, very clever, so still able to communicate with people around them in sort of meeting their basic needs. Now, again, there's a huge amount of variability in child development in all things, and this is no different. So this stage in children, if they even spend time in it at all, can last just a few weeks or even a few months. Now, and we've also noted that younger children might stay in this stage longer than older children. But the point I really want to make about this stage is it may look like the child's not doing anything because they're not using the target language. But as I said at the beginning of this slide, they are actually very, very much involved in the whole process of language acquisition. But what's really critical from an educational perspective is that the child is given all opportunities for interaction. Because I think it's quite easy in a stressful classroom situation when a child's being quiet for the child to just sort of be pushed over there. Well, they're not speaking right now, so we won't, we don't want to put undue pressure on them. We don't want to make them feel bad, so we'll just leave them be. And that would also be a mistake. Because what's absolutely critical for all children in this stage of development, and by stage, I mean the early years, is very rich opportunities for social interaction. So even if the child is in the nonverbal phase of their second language development, we really want to try and make sure that the child is still getting a lot of rich social interaction opportunities, because the more exposure they get to English, the more of that language acquisition processing is going to be happening, and that will start helping the child move along the developmental continuum. The next stage is what we call the telegraphic or formulaic speech phase. And this is where the initial second language utterances, the child will begin to produce some English utterances, but they will be relatively formulaic and have not very much original content. So this will be a lot of labeling, counting, naming colors, that sort of thing. They might have multi-word utterances as well, but again, these will be unanalyzed from a linguistic point of view, or again, more formulaic. So I don't know, excuse me, so what, what's happening? These are little phrases that syntactically, morphologically speaking, are actually fairly complex, but the child hasn't analyzed those phrases from any kind of linguistic point of view, just because they're using modal auxiliaries and negation and contraction and all these sorts of things doesn't actually mean that their brains have analyzed the English system in that way. What they're doing is using these as chunks of language because they're, again, smart. They've noted that these are little phrases that get them somewhere in the communication they're carrying out. And then the last stage is the productive use stage. And so ultimately the endpoint of this ideally is the child is reasonably fluent orally with their target language. But again, there's development within this phase as well. So there will still be memorized chunks at the productive stage, but hopefully, you know, the frequency of those will be relatively small, and then that will be overtaken by more productive language. And by productive language, I mean an utterance which is mostly original, that the child has initiated on their own, and that instead of just parroting phrases, they are actually creating syntactically novel sentences, novel phrases, and so forth. They might have, again, in the earlier stages of this phase, they might be using what we call syntactic frames. So I do plus noun, I do that, I do coloring, or I want plus noun is very common in young children. So that we would call a kind of semi-formulaic frame, because the I want part is just a formula, but adding in a noun that reflects what the child wants to communicate is the productive part. So in this stage, young EAL learners are going to sound more like non-native second language learners of their English. And they're going to make lots of errors, as second language learners do, and as children developing their native language do. And they're going to make errors on vocabulary and grammar in particular. So again, knowing that this is going to be an error-prone or error-full, if you like, stage, we can be more relaxed about those errors when we see them and not worry too much about that. So I hope that gave you a kind of very, very brief overview of the different stages of development that we can predictably expect many, if not most, EAL children to go through on their way to becoming fluent in the second and target language. So I'd like to move on to the next point now, which is the first language influence on second language development. This is an interesting area for me. I do quite a bit of research in this in terms of looking at cross-linguistic influence across linguistic systems within the mind of the multilingual child. Now, the first language can provide essential scaffolding or support for building knowledge in the second language for the child. So the first language is an asset, is a resource from which the child can draw, and even the teacher can draw in trying to support the children's development of different aspects of English, the target second language. And this is even more so if the child has some literacy skill in the home language. So one of the things that I regularly recommend when asked is to try and help the child develop literacy skills in the home language. And when I'm asked by parents, of course, but if teachers can encourage parents to do that too, that would be great, because developing literacy skills where relevant in the home language can really support both the development of the home language. It can support metalinguistic awareness and skills, but really provide a great foundation for the development of English. At the same time as being supportive, however, the first language can also result in, can have a negative, if you like, influence, in that it can result in some errors or transfer errors, as we call them. So a classic transfer error would be a case of somebody who speaks a language like Italian, which can drop its first person pronouns. So in English, I have to say, I speak Italian, but in Italian, you can say, posso parlare l'italiano without saying io, okay? And that's because all of the endings on the verbs tell you exactly who's doing the speaking. So we don't need those pronouns, but we really need them in English. And it's very common for people who speak languages like Italian to assume that they can drop the pronouns in English as well. And this would be the kind of error that we would predictably expect to see as a kind of transfer or influence error in children as well who are learning English as an additional language. But the problem is, of course, for teachers, is that without knowing that and without knowing the home languages, it can just be difficult to predict. So that's, again, something that we have to be able to keep our eyes on. Now, in relation to the whole issue of the first language supporting the second language, there's a whole new area that has been talked about a lot recently in terms of pedagogy, which is called translanguaging. And I would prefer the term multilingual pedagogy for various reasons, which I'm happy to talk about later. But multilingual pedagogy is just that, which is you as a teacher would draw from all of the languages that the child knows as a way of supporting their development of English, but also their education in English, through English. Now, one of the things I want to point out right away, and there will be people who will disagree with me what I'm saying here, but I am right, that right as of today, there is very little what I would call systematic, rigorous, empirical evidence to support the claim that a multilingual pedagogical approach is effective. There is some evidence that people have collected in different contexts over time that is much more descriptive about positive impacts of it, but we need sort of more larger scale, empirical, experimental designs to really see the cause and effect between using a multilingual approach versus not. Now, I think there is real potential here, though. I think multilingual pedagogy could be very appropriate and very supportive because of evidence that we have in other spheres. So some evidence from children, EAL children who are in bilingual schools, not from England, by the way, but in the US, that evidence shows that kids in bilingual schools tend to do better linguistically and academically than EAL children who are attending English-only schools. So that suggests that there is merit to educating through and supporting the first language. Again, when we have all the work of Jim Cummins, who has said that when a learner has two languages available to them, input in either can contribute to the linguistic development and proficiency and curriculum understanding in both of those languages. And also, we have quite a bit of descriptive evidence which suggests, and this is really important, that EAL learners report feeling valued and more engaged with what's happening in the classroom when both of their languages, or I should say all of their languages, are acknowledged and celebrated within a classroom context. So what I would like to say, and I think this is a relevant thing to say in the context of research school event, is that what we really need now is more collaboration between people like me and teachers to be able to really together investigate carefully the impact and efficacy of adopting a multilingual approach. And I'm kind of just saying that because if someone like me, that is to say a researcher, ever comes knocking on your school door to ask if you'd like to participate in a project that's looking at this, I would, if you were able to accommodate that research project, I would highly recommend that you do. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was how long it takes. How long can we sort of predictably expect it will take the EAL child to develop mastery of English, and what factors might influence that? Now, one of the things I want to just first point out is that there is a very strong expectation that they will master English. Unlike, for example, if I was about to start learning Mandarin tomorrow, and I don't know any Mandarin, I'm sorry to say, people wouldn't really expect me to ever become perfectly fluent and native-like in Mandarin because I'm an old lady and I would be learning it as a, as a foreign language. Yet we put expectations on our EAL children that they're going to master this language, which is not their, well, for some of them, not their native language. One of the things I want to make also very clear is that children do not soak up languages like sponges, which is a phrase that is often used. We make assumptions that children have a natural interest and a natural talent to be able to just pick up languages. And I think this assumption is one of the reasons why we don't see EAL in the curriculum, really. We don't see EAL in ITT programs much. Because I think there's just sort of a feeling, particularly for children in the early years settings, that because they're young, they're going to get it eventually. They'll be fine. We don't have to worry about them for now. And I think this is a terrible assumption, because in terms of the research, that isn't true. It takes years. It takes years for a native speaking child to develop competence and mastery of their native language. We know, for example, that native speakers are still learning aspects of their native language, even when they're like 9 years old, okay? And of course, word learning happens over the span of a lifetime. So it's really not the case that EAL children will just soak it up like a sponge overnight. And we really need to be mindful of the fact that they can often appear much more linguistically sophisticated than they really are. So remember, I talked about the child using formulaic chunks like, what's happening? I don't know. These are actually linguistically complex structures, and they might be able to use them perfectly in terms of how they pronounce it and when they use them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their brains have analyzed the whole linguistic system and they have that knowledge available to them. So I think it's really important for us to be aware of that. So what can we expect then, realistically, in terms of rate of second language development? Well, this is a question we'd all love a clear answer to. We know from research, very old research now, from Lily Wong Fillmore, and I would highly recommend you read her work if you have the opportunity, that only 5 out of 48 children after 2 years had what she referred to as a reasonable fluency of English. And this was children whose first language was Spanish or Cantonese, and they were in the US nursery context. Cummins has famously said many times that children who are EAL need between 5 to 7 years to obtain full proficiency in verbal academic skills. And all children need to develop academic language to be able to take full advantage of the curriculum that they have exposed to. So I think the main thing I really want to say here and bring home is that there's huge variability, both within children, but also across different aspects of language in terms of how long it will take them to really have mastered the second language. They might be able to master certain structures in certain contexts, but then make errors on it another way. And just to hammer this point home about the length of time it takes, a number of years I was at a conference in Toronto and Jim Cummins was speaking, and he was telling us about a research project where he was working with some EAL children, but they were, I think, 16. They were like at the end of secondary school in Toronto. And these were children who had been educated through the Toronto system since the beginning. And yet these children, these students, were still behind the native speaking English kids in terms of certain aspects of vocabulary and scores on reading comprehension. So it can take a long, long time. In fact, for some children, they might never actually catch up to native speakers, but they can, and I think they can, particularly with appropriate pedagogical support. Right, so how quickly can they learn English? Well, they can learn a lot very, very quickly in terms of being able to just talk about non-academic things like what they did on the weekend and so forth. But to really develop the kind of language competence that we want our children to be able to develop in order to really excel academically, it can take many, many years, but there's a huge amount of variability that we need to be mindful of. So in terms of factors that influence or impact on this rate, well, this is a really difficult question from a research perspective because we have a chicken and an egg problem. because we call this area of research individual differences. And someone's degree of motivation, for example, is an individual difference. You can have one child highly motivated and another child is not. So you might want to say that the highly motivated child is going to make more rapid progress in English, and that is actually often true, but not always. You might also say that the outgoing child the more extroverted child will be more likely to make more rapid progress in English. And again, that is more true, but that is often true. But again, the chicken and the egg problem is it the case that the outgoing and motivated child is more successful, or that success leads the child to become more outgoing and more motivated to continue learning and developing their linguistic skills? So it's very, very difficult to establish a causal relationship between variables when we're looking at the question of what factors impact on second language development. But again, I think for us, what's really important to note is there is not one single equation. There's no one single package of learner characteristics and situational characteristics that are going to be able to always categorically and accurately predict what and how quickly a child is going to be learning their language. So it's important to be mindful of that variability. Now, looking at the impact of the home language, I would like to refer you to my colleague Alex Hodgkiss's review of research on this topic that was recently published in the EAL journal, published by NALDIC. Now, if you don't know what NALDIC is, I am going to plug this. I'm no longer the chair, so I don't feel guilty at all doing it. NALDIC stands for National Association for Language Development in the Curriculum, and it is the subject association for EAL in England. It's a wonderful organization, and if you work with EAL students, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you become a member, because they publish this EAL journal termly, which is a fantastic publication and is full of resources, and also regularly has reviews of research. And Alex's review of research on the impact of the home language appeared in the last but one NALDIC EAL journal. Now, clearly, the research shows us that there is a clear relationship between the presence of English in the home and the English skills of the EAL child. Not surprisingly, the more frequent input in English the child gets in the home, the stronger the English skills in the child. But this sometimes weakens when the child actually gets to school, because the sort of tsunami of English input the child has in the school context overtakes the power of the role of English in the home context in supporting the child. And also the presence of a native speaker has a very powerful influence in terms of promoting English in the EAL child. However, using the home language, I would argue, is often more important for EAL children in the home. So this is particularly so when the parents don't speak English very proficiently. So Shaghaygh was telling us about her mother using English with her, even though her mother didn't speak English. Now that is totally fine, I would say, if you're just sort of labeling things in your ambient environment. But I would strongly recommend that if the parents don't speak English very well, they should not be speaking English to the child in the home. And this is actually something that's often recommended, that the parents should be speaking English. But the thing is, what a child really needs more than English is they need rich, complex linguistic input. And they need, therefore, their parents to speak the language or languages that the parents themselves have the most proficiency in and the most, are most comfortable in. And because the child's going to get a whole load of input in English when they get to school, but they need that sort of foundation of their home language to be really fully and richly supported. So, and not to mention that we don't want children to be English speakers. We want English to be multilingual. So they need to maintain and develop their home language in order to do that. And if we don't do something about that, then they could lose their home language entirely, which we want to avoid. So first language maintenance then and proficiency in English or the second language are not mutually exclusive events. Both things can happen and happen really well to a very high level. We really need to avoid what many call subtractive linguistic environments where neither language is being properly supported. Now that happens in contexts where the parents who don't speak English very well are trying to speak English to the child in the home. So the child's home language is not being developed, but their English isn't being developed super well either because the input that they're getting from their parents in the home isn't very rich because these are not language. This is not a language the parents themselves speak. So that would be considered a subtractive linguistic or bilingual environment. And if we don't maintain the home languages, as I've already mentioned, there's a whole host of problems, not, that range in terms of what sort of aspects of the child's life they tap into. So a big one is that if the child can't speak the home language, then they lose the opportunities to be able to interact with members of their family, parents, sometimes maybe grandparents, and so on. The perceived first language can sometimes be used as a marker of minority group inferiority, which I think is a big problem. And we also have reason to believe that proficiency in more than one language can have academic benefits. And of course, if the home language is not maintained and developed, then this can compromise what those benefits might be. And the home language loss can affect the child's social and psychological well-being as well, because it disconnects them from their family and their community. We also, as I've already mentioned today, children who have literacy skills in their first language can often be very skilled at learning developing literacy skills in their second language, like the one can support the other. And so that's another reason why we want to maintain the home language and support it, particularly in terms of becoming literate, because it can have important impacts on the child developing literacy in the L2, not to mention the fact they can read in their L1, which in and of itself would be really cool and good for the child. So why should we bother then supporting multilingualism? I've already mentioned a few reasons just there. An obvious one is that most people in the world are multilingual. And therefore, multilingual discourses are becoming the norm. And if, the day will probably come where monolinguals will be extremely difficult to find. And if we are a nation that's really good at developing monolingualism, then it's one of the many ways in which we may be left behind. There may be many cognitive advantages to being bilingual, and I say may because this is an area of research that is being hotly debated. There's been quite a lot of press about potential advantages, which is really exciting. Some of those are not always replicable in different research contexts, but there could be cognitive advantages. As I've already mentioned a moment ago, there is good evidence that there are advantages in terms of metalinguistic awareness, which is really important for reading skills. And we also have some suggested evidence that it can be advantageous in terms of learning other languages. So children have to learn foreign languages in schools. We have evidence that EAL children do better at that than non-EAL children in English schools. And I would just say the obvious, that being bilingual or multilingual is advantageous because you can speak another language. And that's a good thing. It can promote intercultural awareness and understanding and do all sorts of other things. It opens up another world if you can speak another language. And that in and of itself, to me, is a reason why we should be supporting multilingualism in educational spheres. So in summary, young EAL children build their English skills very slowly. They're not sponges. It takes time and they will make errors along the way. Their first utterances are typically very short and very formulaic. There is a lot of individual variability between EAL children in terms of how quickly they develop their skills in English. Exposure to English is extremely important, but it's not always indicative of how advanced a child will end up becoming. and maintaining proficiency in the home language, and not even maintaining, but developing proficiency and developing literacy in the home language has really important benefits, psychosocial and cognitive educational benefits to the child. And this is much more difficult in contexts where the child is educated entirely in the second language, like the context in which we find ourselves in England. So in summary, I'll just say being multilingual is a good thing. Schools can do a lot more to support multilingual development, and I would love to be able to encourage schools to do everything they can in order to promote multilingualism. And on that, I'll just say thank you very much for your time. I've just, again, shamelessly flogged some books that I've written, one of which is not mine, but a highly useful text for teachers and speech language therapists. It's very useful in terms of discussions about how to tease apart typical second language development from disordered development, which could indicate some kind of language disorder. So that's it from me. I guess I should stop sharing my screen now. Is that right?
That would be great. So first of all, what an extraordinary amount you've packed into that. So, and I know from the chat that people have hugely appreciated the richness and how thought-provoking that was. So I'm going to hand over to Fliss and Shaghaygh to lead a conversation with you, Professor Murphy, and also we will keep an eye on the chat and put some comments or questions from the chat to you. So, so Professor Murphy, Fliss, Shaghaygh, if you want to unmute, we'll listen in to what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation between the three of you, and also pick up on the chat.
Julian. Yeah, I just wanted to say firstly, thanks so much to Shaghaygh, and just such a powerful story that I think everybody was really so interested in and really moved by as well. So thank you so much for sharing that, and also just also to echo people's points in the chat about how wonderful Victoria's presentation has been to listen to. Really thought-provoking. Thank you.
Thank you, Fliss.
Yeah, it really was. I think, thank you for all the lovely messages that was written in the chat. And it's just amazing that everything Professor Victoria was saying afterwards, that kind of, some of those experiences that kind of I have gone through as well. And I think it is really important. And, even now, that, like I said, there's still so much that I do sometimes have to think twice about. There are certain words that I might not pronounce as well as it should be. I don't kind of see it as a problem, because I have all these resources and tools to kind of go and research how to say something. And I think, well, no matter what happens, I'm EAL. I was still 9.5, almost going on 10 when I came to this country. And so I'm learning the same as everyone else. And I think it's really important to be able to kind of keep that in mind at all times. And, again, what Professor Victoria was saying about as an adult, my mum still, bless her, there's so many things that, sometimes when she doesn't know what to say, she sends me a message. She was like, right, I've sent you an email, proofread it and let me know if it's accurate. It's like, okay. And, it's just what it is, but it's such a powerful thing to be able to have, I think, more than one language.
But importantly, no one's expecting your mum to sound like a fluent native speaker of English, but they expected that of you.
Yeah, they did.
Even though, you didn't have any English at the time that you arrived either. So we put these enormous expectations on our young people, and they rise to them most of the time, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. And it is challenging. And I think we need to be very mindful of the fact that it takes that time.
Absolutely. And I think what really stood out for me when listening to your presentation was really those sort of myths and misconceptions that have arisen over the years, like, children languages like sponges. And that's something that, you know, is really interesting. We really have to challenge that, don't we? And the impact, the potential impact of that, because there is this sort of belief, isn't there? And actually, I think that that's so important to remember, that actually it takes that effort and, you know, real kind of motivation, hard work on part of the child as well. So I think we really have to acknowledge that and really kind of bust that myth as much as possible. There's a couple of really interesting comments in the chat that I think would be really brilliant to acknowledge. Firstly, one of them around, you know, and it's interesting because actually both Shaghaygh and Victoria, you picked up on this idea of what it feels like for a child to come into a setting, and how to make them feel at ease. And so Catherine has asked, you know, if a child comes to school for the first time, doesn't understand any English whatsoever, how can we make them feel at ease? And just one of my own kind of reflections on this, as we've heard you all speaking, was when you said, Shaghaygh, about the power of practitioners, of teachers learning a few words in that language, in terms of how that can really, really emotionally support and that sort of that welcome that it can provide a child. What are your thoughts on this question? How to make a child feel at ease when they don't have that English?
Shaghaygh, do you want to go first?
I mean, I was just going to say, even being able to do the register in the child's home language can go a really long way, just greeting them. And I think that in itself it's a very lovely thing to be able to do. But also, you know, those first couple of weeks, I remember for me, it was just, I wanted to go to school, but at the same time, I was always so anxious and I was so scared because nobody could really understand me. And it's really lovely to be able to have someone that you can buddy up with. But I think also being really mindful who, you know, a child is kind of, you know, is going to be that other person that's going to support them through it. But for me, I mean, no one ever spoke any kind of Persian Farsi when I was at school. But, you know, what we do now is we try and at least have a couple of words in those languages. So before the child starts, we always try and ask the parents if we can, or, you know, at the moment we've got a few Russian children. So one of my TAs, bless her, she's always on Google Translate and tries to support that child as much as possible. And they're feeling welcome. So that's my experience from it.
There's another really fascinating question in the chat as well. And for you, Victoria, you know, is there, you know, the question is there any research around, you know, children who are staying in that sort of non-verbal silent phase? We have this particular person has sort of referred to a family where the older brother is refusing to speak English and is a selective communicator, 4th year in primary, and just, you know, what kind of support could be provided for that family, for that child, and just that question about the research around children staying in that sort of phase for a little bit longer than we would expect or hope to.
Yeah, that's obviously an important question. I think I just want to make a sort of disclaimer that I'm a researcher and I can speak to the research, and I feel less confident in sort of recommending practice because this isn't my sphere. Though, of course, the research that I do speaks to that sphere. So I think there's an important distinction to be made between selective mutism and children in the nonverbal period. There are children who selectively choose not to speak, and usually that's a signal of something else going on in the child's life. And so the fact that they've just chosen not to communicate is a signal of other traumas, other issues. And so tackling the language problem isn't going to help because it isn't really a language problem anyway. In terms of the silent period, I would say that it's not that common that a child will stay in it for a very long period of time because children like to communicate in their environment. They like to tell people what they want and what they're doing and look at me and get involved in my life. We have a natural inclination to do that. And we also have a natural capacity to acquire more than one language. And so while it takes time, I think the whole sort of soaking it up like sponges phrase is, you know, a manifestation of our regular observations that children are successful at doing this. So I guess my first suggestion is don't panic when you see that the child's in a stage where they are reluctant to communicate for various reasons. If it really, really persists for a very long time, then I would recommend the child is seen by a professional speech and language therapist. But you know, as I said earlier in my presentation, the key thing is to make sure that the child knows that they're welcome, that just because they're cutting themselves off from productively engaging linguistically doesn't mean they're cut off from the interaction in any way, shape, or form, and that they are made to feel, and they are included in whatever is going on in the setting at the time. So that's maybe not a satisfactory answer, because you want to know exactly what can I do if this child is continuing. If the child is continuing for a ridiculously long time, I would say go and seek some professional guidance. But don't panic if the child is not using their language for a period of time, because this is relatively predictable.
I think that's the really key thing, isn't it? It's really kind of getting to know that child, really understanding how they interact within that setting, and really kind of being aware and attuned to their development. So you can kind of make a bit more of a judgment from the close observation and all that, the rich interaction that you can have with children in making them feel incredibly welcomed and settled, but also just being really kind of, sort of attuned to it so that you can make those decisions when need be. And it's also really important, I think, in that instance to kind of really have those rich conversations as much as possible with the families, with the parents, the caregivers, to understand what the child's home language is like. You know, are they communicating really sort of fluently and effectively well at home, so that actually you can kind of have that sort of awareness of how that home language is developing, or more than one language is developing, and then be able to kind of understand where that child is in that kind of sort of phase for that sort of period of time. I think that that's a really important thing to consider also.
Yeah, I agree. Knowing your child is such a powerful tool for teachers.
And there's just a couple of other comments in the chat that I think would be really useful to pull out. One comment around having bilingual staff in school, and thinking about sort of what is the best practice in terms of speaking in home languages versus English, particularly with new arrivals and children in the early years. I think that's a really, really interesting question. I mean, sort of from my sort of personal professional kind of experience, I think that in terms of really utilizing those staff where appropriate to really support children's home language in the setting is such a wonderful opportunity. If anyone else wants to comment on that.
I mean, I really agree with that. I think it's just such a amazing tool to be able to have staff that do speak the languages that children do. And just again, if they are in the early years, in particular for reception and nursery, to have those additional adults sit fairly close to the children, because then quite a lot of that translation can happen, or that pre-vocabulary teaching can take place as well. But we've got a child in year 1 who's from Iran, so sometimes if I'm covering in an afternoon, I'll teach something in English and then I'll quickly stop and I'll explain it to him in like Persian, so then he knows what it is that he has to do, and I'll go in and I'll check in on him. So I think it's just really beneficial to utilize all those adults.
Can I just add, I agree, I totally agree. But as I said in my presentation, what I think we don't have from a research base, from an evidence base, is the actual direct answer to the question, which is what is the best practice? And in order to be able to answer that question, I would argue we need to submit different approaches to what I would call empirical scrutiny, where we try something out in one group of children compared to a control group, or trying something else out and seeing what is more effective on a particular outcome, whatever that outcome may be. It could be academic achievement, it could be linguistic proficiency, reading skills, it could be engagement, you know, how the child feels in the school, do they enjoy it? I mean, there's so many different variables we could look at. But I would say that to really answer the question about best practice of using the home language on different outcomes, we need that research that, in my view, doesn't exist yet.
That's so important, isn't it? To always come back to that evidence base, that rigorous research that we can really utilize as our sort of best bets to really help guide us, which is so important, and you know, really exciting opportunities for research there that could be, you know, begun to be undertaken. Absolutely. Got so many great comments in the chat. It's just so interesting to see, and Victoria, you sort of said about, you know, sort of thinking about the evidence side of it, and really kind of as a researcher, and then thinking about, I guess, from like mine and Shaghaygh's perspective, as well as practitioners, and thinking about kind of like the synthesis of these things. It's just so interesting, and we're getting such wonderful kind of examples in the chat of ways in which to really enhance, enrich those interactions, thinking about how to kind of make children feel really at ease. And I think, you know, sort of pulling on all of those really powerful threads that you've highlighted from the evidence, Victoria, is just really coming through from people's kind of suggestions and thoughts and experiences.
I mean, this is what makes these sorts of events so fantastic, and why, among other reasons, I was delighted to be able to participate, because I think the relationship between researchers and practitioners could be improved. And I think we both have something to do in that process. You know, researchers certainly can do a lot more in terms of making their research more accessible and more relevant, and looking at establishing more collaborative relationships with teachers in schools. It's a very difficult time for people like me to do research in schools, because understandably it's a very difficult time for schools just to be open every day and have staff and students even show up. So, you know, when a researcher knocks on the door and says, please, can we do research, when you're already, it's extremely challenging, of course. But if any of you who are teachers or in a position to be able to collaborate with researchers, I would just love to encourage you to do that.
And I think, you know, from my perspective, in my sort of dual role, you know, I'm teaching part-time, but also working with EYFS. It's really interesting, because a really important thing is about how, as Julian was sort of saying, you know, we need to mobilize that evidence. We need to find ways to translate it and bridge that gap, and ensure that we are utilizing that evidence, but also making it accessible so that people can really think about how it can be used in their context with their children to really make a difference for children.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I think that's probably a great kind of call to arms for us to finish on there. And we've got this amazingly passionate and dedicated workforce on screen on the 15th of December at 5:13, and we promised our webinar would run to time, and it absolutely will. But we can see that there is real interest through the chat in taking this further. Initially, we can do that by adding stuff to the Padlet. We would also welcome anyone who would like, for example, to write a voice from the classroom blog, even if it's just to share some of your challenges or your experiences, and as well as things that have succeeded, research that you've found useful. But for now, we are going to finish on time and just say a huge thank you to Victoria, Shaghaygh, and Fliss, and a very huge thank you to all of the people who've joined in this evening. We want to take this further, but for now, I think we just salute you for your energy and interest. Wish you a happy and peaceful break when it comes. And for those of us celebrating Christmas, wish you a happy Christmas too. Thank you so much, everyone. And connect with us. We're all over the socials, so join in with us. We love hearing from you.
Thank you, Julian. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you, everyone.
I don't want to end the meeting because people are sending such nice messages, but I'm going to end the meeting in a moment and let everyone get on. And Fliss and I have pizza to eat with the staff team here as well. Great. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Pamela. Thanks for everyone who's taken the moment to put something in the chat. We really appreciate that. And like I said, have a good evening and have a great break when it comes to you.